Hello, everyone. We will now start the Renewable Energy Institute webinar, Building Performance Standards for Existing Buildings, a View from the US and Europe. I will be serving as the moderator today. I am Yuko Nishida from the Renewable Energy Institute. We will have a program for the next hour and a half. First, we have simultaneous interpretation service available. At the bottom of the screen, you might see a globe icon. You can choose the language of your preference, either in Japanese or in English. If you have a question, please press the Q&A button to submit your questions. We may not have enough time to cover all the questions, but we will try our best. And about the presentation materials, we have the original in English, and we have also posted the Japanese translated version on our website for your reference. Let us get started. Currently, deliberations are underway in the Japanese Diet for a revision of the Building Energy Efficiency Act. If it is revised, finally, we will have mandatory compliance where all new homes and buildings cannot be built unless energy efficiency standards are satisfied. But I would say that we are only getting to the starting point of decarbonization of the building sector. The journey ahead is still long and hard, especially when it comes to existing homes and buildings. We cannot say that sufficient studies are being carried out. But looking around the world, we can see that many effective policies are already rolled out. So today, we will be taking up the topic of the introduction of mandatory building performance standards for existing buildings. This is a very powerful policy, and at the same time, it is a method that is applicable to countries around the world. We believe that it is a policy that will be considered in all countries and regions around the world that have no time to waste for decarbonization. We have experts from the US and Europe to give us a talk today, and we hope to ask them questions from the Japanese perspective. Let me introduce the speakers. From New York, United States, we have Mr. Adam Hinch, Managing Director of Sustainable Energy Partnerships. Over the years, he has been providing consulting services on building energy efficiency, and he is indeed the authority in this field. When I was at the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, we were conducting comparative studies of building decarbonization measures with officials in New York City, Los Angeles, and Singapore, and he has always been a reliable advisor since. It is 2:30 in the morning in New York. Sorry about cutting your sleep, but thank you very much for joining us for the program today. And the next speaker is from Europe, and joining us from Belgium today is Ms. Louise Sunderland. She is Senior Advisor of the Regulatory Assistance Project. She has been working on achieving efficiency and sustainability in the area of building and energy over the years. Because she has been involved very closely with policy making, she is just the right person for today's discussion. It must be 8:30 in the morning in Belgium, a bit early in the morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. So let us hear from the two experts about the situations in the US and Europe. Starting with Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuko. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to join all of you today. As Yuko mentioned, it's quite early in the morning in New York where I am. So my apologies up front if I appear a bit tired at times. So I was very pleased when Yuko had approached me a few months ago about organizing this webinar. And it builds on an event that she and I collaborated on working together in September 2019, when a delegation of Japanese experts had come to New York for a UN climate meetings, and we had organized a side event about building energy and climate policies in leading US and Japanese cities. And perhaps some of my friends who I met from Japan who had come over for that meeting a couple of years ago are listening in today. So this seems very timely. There's been a lot of activity in the United States since September 2019 when we had that event here. And I'm very pleased that my colleague Louise Sunderland from Europe is able to join us and bring the European perspective today. So I will now try and bring up some slides, and hopefully we will not have any technical difficulties here. I'm assuming that people can see the slides now. If that's not possible, just please let me know. So I will start off by saying that the title here that Yuko had thought we wanted to cover is Energy Performance Standards Policies for Existing Buildings in the US cities and states. Not all of these are energy standards. Some of them are in emissions or environmental standards. So I will cover that a bit more in as I get into this. But what are building performance standards? And these are a couple of definitions and documents from a report I'd recently written for the International Energy Agency that has a building energy codes working group. But I think the important pieces in this slide are that that performance standards require building owners to meet some performance benchmark or target, kind of the target, generally an energy performance rating or energy or carbon intensity. And the rating or the carbon or energy intensity is what's usually called the metric of measure. And then often giving building owners multiple years to bring the buildings into compliance, sometimes with stage requirements increasing in stringency over time. And that really helps build into the building owner's capital planning cycles so that it doesn't require immediate investment, but instead can allow capital planning when equipment or other major systems would need to be replaced anyway. And I think an important piece is that performance standards can require action from all building owners, not just when there might otherwise be a construction process going on. I seem to be, there we are. Okay, so how do building performance standards differ from energy codes? And part of this, I think, is important that most buildings practitioners are more familiar with building energy codes, but not so much with performance standards, as they're much more of a new type of policy. And again, this table and the next one are from the report I'd prepared for the International Energy Agency's Building Energy Codes Working Group, which is part of the International Energy Agency Technical Collaboration Program on Energy in Buildings and Communities. And the report was titled Building Energy Codes and Other Mandatory Policies Applied to Existing Buildings. I think the important pieces here, as if in the left column, energy codes, and these are energy codes as applied to existing buildings, can sometimes be applied to substantial renovation or alteration projects, but really are a one-time requirement and not an ongoing continuous improvement opportunity. Whereas performance standards are based on some threshold of building energy or carbon performance, the metric, as I said a little while ago, and sometimes linked to a performance rating. Louise will talk about energy performance certificates, which is that performance rating in Europe. And in the United States, we have a voluntary large building rating system, the Energy Star rating, that I'll talk more about in a bit. But I think the important piece is this gives owners the signal that they need to meet a performance level by a given date. And often that performance level can be ratcheted up over time to send a longer term signal for that. Some of the other key differences between energy codes and performance standards when applied to existing buildings. I won't talk as much about the codes because I think the focus of what we're talking about today is really the performance standards. But this can trigger major energy improvement activity without other construction being a trigger. There should be more significant volume of building energy improvements because a larger portion of the building stock is required to do something different. And there's the potential for a longer term glide path with regular ratcheting up of the standards. A couple of the challenges, and we'll talk more about this is a relatively new policy lever, There are not many mature policies in place, which creates some uncertainty. And I think industry stakeholders are really more coming up to speed on this. And it's relatively new, and that does bring some risks with it. This is a map of what jurisdictions, the cities and states that have building performance standards policies in place in the United States at this point. And this is a map that's been changing pretty regularly over the past year. When Yuko and I had worked together on the event in New York, I think there were just New York City, Washington, D.C., and one or two other jurisdictions. And I think we're up to about 13 now. And just a couple of these, the state of Maryland and Denver, Colorado, have just added performance standard policies within the past month or two. So this map is quite regularly updated. I will say that all of these are policies that have passed generally with a legislation that put them into place, but none of them are yet in effect with requiring compliance. The first mandatory compliance period is in 2024 in New York City, and then many of these other jurisdictions follow shortly after that. This map and a few other things that you'll see through here are prepared by the Institute for Market Transformation, which is a research and advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., and I serve as their volunteer chair of their board of directors. And you'll see a number of different slides coming through from the Institute for Market Transformation. So besides these cities that have adopted them, there's growing interest. And in late January, the US White House, the President Biden and Vice President Harris launched a new coalition of states and local governments to strengthen building performance standards. And there are 33 different cities and states that have so far made a commitment that by Earth Day 2024, they will have some regulation or legislation in place for a building performance standard. And there's more information on this National Building Performance Standard Coalition website. And I will have a number of links at the end of the presentation that will give you some more ideas of exactly where you can go for more information. One of the things you'll see with this map is it's kind of similar to a different map, and the building performance standards really generally build on other energy reporting policies that have been in place for a longer period of time in a lot of these US jurisdictions, mostly cities here. Some states have considered some of these policies as well, but for the most part, we have cities that have taken policy leadership. And this goes back really to around 2008, 2009, when a number of cities, again, led by Washington, D.C. and New York City, developed what we call benchmarking and transparency policies that require annual reporting of building energy performance and disclosure of that to the public. These jurisdictions have performance policies in place now. Some of them also require energy audits, but you can see a lot of similarities on this map with the one that I showed of the previous slide with the National Building Performance Standard Coalition. I will say that one of the things that is important, and we'll get into this more in the discussion after Louise has presented, is that most all of these benchmarking and transparency policies rely on a voluntary program in the United States, the Energy Star Portfolio Manager energy reporting and benchmarking system that was developed probably 25 years ago by the US Environmental Protection Agency. And what that does is gives a simplified 1 to 100 score, kind of gets away from the technical arcane numbers, units of energy or carbon per floor area, and instead really drives it to a very simplified, normalized 1 to 100 score, with 1 as the worst performer and 100 as the best. That kind of lets you measure all of the different buildings on more of a comparable basis for their relative energy efficiency. So again, let me now just kind of give a little bit of a summary of the the key criteria for some of the building performance standards that are in place in the United States. And again, you can see the two earliest ones, or three earliest ones, were enacted in 2019, about 3 years ago at this point. Commercial is the C in the building types included, and multifamily residential is the MF. My apologies that the United States is the only country, I think, still in the world that uses floor area and non-metric units, but 10,000 square feet is equivalent to about 1,000 square meters. And you can see that the minimum building size covered ranges from about 1,000 square meters up to 5,000 square meters. And then a variety of different metrics. I mentioned the voluntary Energy Star score, the 1 to 100 score. That's the basis for the standard in Washington, D.C. In New York City and in Boston and Maryland, the annual greenhouse gas emissions are the requirement, and in a couple of other jurisdictions, the energy intensity. And the energy intensity is measured in different ways in the US. For the most part, most of the jurisdictions that have developed building performance standards are looking at what in the US we call site energy intensity, which is kind of the secondary or delivered energy intensity, as different from primary energy intensity, which in the US is known as source energy intensity or source energy use, that includes all of the losses in the generation and transmission of any energy use in the building, whereas the site or secondary energy use is really just the energy used in the building, not including those losses. So again, you can see the initial year of performance requirements. The first one is New York City in 2024. With this in mind, I'll just kind of go into a little more detail on three of the leading policies. New York City's Local Law 97 of 2019, again, kind of built on some earlier policies that had been passed back in 2009 in New York, the Greater Buildings Laws that had been passed back in the Bloomberg administration. But Local Law 97, which is part of the city's Climate Mobilization Act, established this timeline that you can see toward the top, where the law was passed in just about 3 years ago. And the first emissions limits begin in 2024, and they impact around 20% of the properties. And this graph that I'm showing here is not really detailed, it's more stylized, but this kind of shows the general distribution of building emissions for any given property type. And we have 10 different property types that have limits that are established in the law, with the worst performing 20% from a carbon intensity perspective needing to make improvements by 2024. And then by 2030, a much larger percentage, about 75% of buildings need to make reductions. And as you can see from this, some of them need to be fairly significant reductions. There is a lot of ongoing work right now to develop all the regulations. There was a good deal of detail in the legislation that passed, but still a number of things that need to be finalized by rulemaking. And our New York City Department of Buildings is hard at work with a number of advisory groups and working groups, several of which I participate on, that are working to have the rules that are expected to be finalized by the end of this year and required by law by January 2023. Boston has something a little bit different. They similarly have emissions intensity limits for different building use types. And what they did is, in the law, they actually spelled out a trajectory going from what the requirements were starting in 2025, and then reducing in every 5-year block such that they get down to zero emissions by 2050. So this, I think, is fairly elegant. We'll see, again, with all of these laws, what the compliance is. I expect there will likely be some more exceptions that come up. One piece I will just mention with the New York law, I think it has the most significant penalties involved, with a fine of $268 US per ton of emissions over the limit, which can result in some quite significant fines for buildings that are over the limit, and many will be, as I said, by 2030. The last one that I'll show details on is the Washington, D.C. Building Energy Performance Standard. And this one is based on the 1 to 100 normalized Energy Star score, kind of our energy performance certificate equivalent. And as you can see here, this is a group of sample buildings that would need to all perform at least at the median Energy Star score by 2026. So you can see the buildings that are kind of in the light blue, they're already over the median Energy Star score, so they don't need to do anything in the short term, but the buildings that are in the orange would need to bring their performance up. And again, this is different from an energy or carbon intensity in that 100 is the best performing building under the Energy Star score, and 1 is the lowest performing. So these ones that are below the median line will need to make their improvements by 2026. And then in 2026, a second performance cycle would begin that would set a different set of performance improvement targets. This slide comes from a report I had worked on with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy about 2 years ago, where we tried to look at the performance standards that were in place and what were some of the different pros and cons of the different metrics. And I think the biggest differences right now are whether you look at energy use intensity, which might be normalized through the Energy Star normalization process, or just be the raw energy per floor area, or whether you look at GHG emissions. And I think a couple of the big differences, energy use intensity emphasizes energy efficiency is a real benefit. Yet, if you look at GHG emissions, that gets at the ultimate goal for what most of the jurisdictions are interested in, and that's reducing the GHG emissions. The GHG emissions, if any sorts of offsets or renewable energy credits or trading are allowed, does give a lot more flexibility for owners. But the negative with that is it could de-emphasize energy efficiency if those credits and offsets are widely available. In New York, as I've said, we do have the GHG emissions intensity as our metric. And there are some concerns that because of fairly wide expected availability, not right by the beginning of the first compliance period, but as time goes on, more renewable energy credits that would be available, that may drive less efficiency improvements than some of the stakeholders would prefer. There are a growing number of resources for cities. A great guidebook that was put out a little less than a year ago by the American Cities Climate Challenge, something that's funded through Bloomberg Philanthropies with a lot of different groups, including the Institute for Market Transformation involved, put out this guidebook for cities that are interested in this, a framework for equitable policies to address existing buildings. And I'm not going to go into this slide in much detail, but I will just say, the different components that you can see, defining the scope of the buildings to be covered, choosing your metric, and then setting targets, and then getting into certain of the compliance, implementation, and enforcement activities really are the critical pieces in terms of development. One other issue that's of growing interest is a focus on equity issues along with climate as the goal. That over the last couple of years, we've had much more interest in the United States on trying to address some long-term inequities and lack of housing affordability. And I will say that the jurisdictions that have developed building performance standards and are working on implementing them are very interested in equity issues. Exactly how that plays out in the policies isn't completely certain yet, but it's something that's of great importance to many of the policymakers. I'm going to kind of wrap up here, and then so we can let Louise present and then have plenty of time for discussion. But through the Institute for Market Transformation, there are many more details about the policies that are in place. I've just kind of put the summary page for Boston on here. And the next slide that I have is really just a set of different resources. The Institute for Market Transformation has a number of different resources. The comparison sheet that I just shown on the previous slide, a model building performance standard ordinance, and you can find all of them there. The Institute for Market Transformation is also somewhat of a secretariat to this National Building Performance Standards Coalition that is run out of the White House Council for Environmental Quality, and there's the link there. The guidebook framework that I mentioned from the American Cities Climate Challenge has a link here, and then also the International Energy Agency Energy Codes Working Group that I mentioned. Here is a link on that. So I think with that, I will stop doing this screen share and turn things back to Yuko and Louise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adam Hinge. The building performance standards, you have kindly explained to us what they are. In major US cities, they were spots and dots on the big American land scale, but in terms of population and the city's level, they are important. And the whole point is that the Biden administration is supporting these endeavors. Those were the key messages. So there are various systems and different ways of metrics. That is an important lesson for all of us. We would like to discuss that later. Now, Louise, it is your turn. Please, will you present us about some of the early endeavors? The floor is yours, Louise.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Adam there for a brilliant update. And I say an update because Adam and I have, I think probably over the last couple of years, taken part in a number of these exchanges between the US and Europe on the progress of these particular building performance standards or minimum energy performance standards. So it's really fascinating to track how the two regions, Europe and the US, are, proceeding. And there's actually lots of similarities, quite a few differences as well. But particular similarity, as Yuko identified there, is that, policies that started at individual city or state level in the US or country level in Europe are now, there are proposals to expand them across the whole region. And I think that's really interesting that those two things are happening at the same, really similar timeframes in the two regions. So similar to Adam, I'm going to just look at a few individual examples of minimum energy performance standards in European countries. And then I'm going to introduce a new proposal that's currently being negotiated, as I say, to expand this approach to the existing stock, to regulating performance of the existing stock across the whole of the 27 EU member states. So before I do, a quick reminder of context on why this is so important in Europe at the moment. So of course, globally, we know about 50% of today's buildings will be in use in 2050, and 60% were erected when there were no building code requirements related to energy performance. In both North America and the European Union, you can see this is particularly important because we have a larger proportion of the stocks that's older, and that's the dark blue bars at the bottom here, but also a larger proportion of the stock that's still going to be around in 2050, and that's the red diamonds. Focusing in on the European stock, it's been estimated that actually up to over 85% of the buildings that we will have in 2050 have already been built. And over 75% of that stock needs some form of renovation with regard to energy or carbon. And these charts here illustrate using Europe's energy performance certificate framework, the performance of the stock, both across the whole of Europe, and that's the lateral bar at the top, and then in some selected countries at the bottom. So this energy performance certificate framework is a framework for assessing buildings and labeling them. And it uses the A to G labeling system, with A being the highest, best performing buildings, and the G being the worst performing buildings. And you can see here that in many countries across the bottom, those worst performing bands, the E, F, and Gs at the bottom of the scale, do make up quite a big proportion of those national stocks. And in Europe, of course, we have statutory climate change targets, so emissions reductions targets of a 55% reduction in 2030. And it's been assessed that to meet that 55% reduction in 2030, the building sector actually needs to go further, needs to make a greater contribution. So that actually needs to meet a 60% reduction in 2030. And this chart here, the blue bars, show the direct emissions from the building sector. And you can see this progress has been made. You know, the policies we had in place, the policies on information, the policies on to provide subsidies for building renovation have been effective to an extent, but they have not been effective to put us on the trajectory to where we need to be really in a very short amount of time in this decade. And you can see the dashed red line shows the trajectory that we now need to put ourselves on. So this is really the context for the introduction of minimum energy performance standards. And as Adam has already outlined, you know, they are a much more impactful, much more significant regulatory approach than the regulatory approaches that we've had for existing buildings before, which has been through building codes. Two major ways that they can have far more impact is that they apply to the whole building, not just the element of the building that's having some form of extension or renovation, where the building code would normally require a standard to be met. And they also apply when even no building works are triggering the application of a code. So, you know, you can see here that actually covering the whole buildings and not requiring these triggers of building works, can be effective to set out a trajectory for the whole stock to meet our binding climate targets. And both Adam and I have done a lot of work looking at all the different, not only the examples within our jurisdictions, but the examples across the world. And they differ hugely in design, which is really interesting to study, but they actually have a lot of similarities. And this is, I think, where the similarities occur, is that they're all made up of these three elements. So the standard or the regulation chooses the target buildings. It defines the standard and the metric used to express it. And then the trigger point, or in fact the date in time. And we will see, we do see certainly in Europe that a lot of the standards are introduced with a firm compliance date, so 2030, 2025, but actually in advance of that, the standard is introduced at building level trigger points. So for example, in the 5 years before the final compliance date, you may need to meet the standard when the building is sold, when the building undergoes a major renovation, or perhaps when the building has a change of tenancy. So using building life cycle trigger points there to introduce. And this is an illustration of the countries that have already introduced in regulation minimum energy performance standards in Europe. And the table here summarizes them. I'm not going to go through all of the examples here, but I think it's interesting to note, first of all, these are the examples that extend to private buildings. There are actually quite a large number of additional standards that apply to social housing. But I'm focusing here on the private sector. Considered kind of more difficult buildings, I think, because obviously they don't have, private sector buildings don't generally have a stock manager where social housing would do. You can see very clearly that they apply to both non-domestic buildings, so offices, tertiary buildings, and homes. And I think that's probably one of the first interesting areas of difference between the US and Europe, is actually quite a number of the standards in Europe apply to homes, and not just big multifamily buildings, but actually both flats in multifamily buildings and individual homes. Interesting to note on that we tend to see the standards that are applying to non-domestic buildings being a little bit more ambitious. So for example, in Netherlands, the standard for office buildings is EPCC. In England and Wales, the standard for privately rented non-domestic buildings has just been raised to EPCB. That's to be complied with by 2030. In France, there's actually a really interesting kind of incrementally improving standard for tertiary buildings and non-domestic buildings, which requires a reduction in final energy use over the decades from 2030 to 2050. Whereas for homes, we tend to see just the very worst performing buildings in those F and G classes that I was talking about earlier on the A to G scale. So just looking at those very worst performing buildings and asking them just to move a relatively, to have a relatively small improvement to the next worst performing, so to the E. So you can see that model is used in France and in England and Wales. And in Flanders, in Belgium, actually a similar approach, but actually defining the physical insulation and glazing measures rather than using the EPC framework. And I think the other thing just to take away from here is that actually a lot of the standards draw on the energy performance certificate framework that we have in Europe. So you can see it's been really important to underpin a number of these standards. So just a couple of slides, because this energy performance certificate framework has been so important in Europe, just a couple of slides to give a little bit more information on it. It's a building assessment and label tool, and it's this building assessment, it calculates an asset rating. So it's the calculated primary energy use, not an operational rating. So it doesn't actually measure energy use in the building, but bases on a calculated assessment. The letter, the label, the easy to communicate label, which is normally an A to G, relates to the energy performance band, which is normally in a kilowatt hour per meter square per year. It's not always the case though, and we'll see in a minute that these are not harmonized across Europe. So a different approach has been taken in different countries within this sort of harmonized framework. The assessment is required when a building is sold or rented, so using those natural trigger points to expand the coverage of the labels across the stock, and those labels have a lifetime of 10 years, after which they would need to be replaced. It was introduced actually quite a long time ago, and it's taken a long time to both then be implemented in member state regulation, but also to be distributed across the stock. And we do have quite variable stock coverage in different countries. So up to 40%, which is really very good in Ireland, and 40% coverage is definitely enough, obviously, to use that data to make a good model of the stock, really manage to kind of look at where performance standards need to focus and look at how those standards should and could be rolled out. On the less good end of the scale, some countries have as low as 3% coverage of the stock. And the final thing that I was mentioning just earlier is that these standards aren't harmonized across all of the European countries. So when I say it's usually an A to G scale, some countries might use an A+, they may have added the A+ as maybe the stock performance has changed, or they've added an A+ for new buildings when new buildings are meeting higher codes. And some countries also use all the way through to an H at the lower end of the scale. And this is just a selected number of countries illustrating to you the lack of harmonization, that actually, as I've said, some countries might use an A+ to an F, or an A to an H. There's not a direct comparison between an A in one country and an A in another country. Equally, as you can see, an A+ in Portugal, the best rating in Portugal is buildings that have an primary energy use of equal to or less than 25 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. Compare that to in Estonia, for example, an A-class building uses equal to or less than 120 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. And similarly, at the lower end of the scale, you see vastly different performance ranges being represented by the labels. And energy performance certificates are not static. They have certainly over time been improved, been adjusted, both through changes in the European framework and also changes at member state level. So, for example, we've seen attempts to introduce a second sort of operational assessment alongside the asset rating. We've also seen recently some member states introducing a carbon metric alongside the energy performance metric. And I've just included here a few of the kind of latest projects that look at sort of the future of these energy performance certificates and how they could actually be made sort of fit for the future, including really interesting ideas about sort of digitalization and full building renovation plans, not only the point in time assessment. So now moving on, I'll just do a little bit of a deep dive into two of the examples. It's two of the examples I think that are most mature, one from the non-domestic sector in the Netherlands here, and then I'll move on to a standard for homes in England and Wales. So this standard for offices in the Netherlands, as I've already said, it requires all offices to be EPC C by 2023. The clear purpose here of introducing this standard was for energy demand reduction and carbon reduction in that sector of the stock. The standard will require more than half of Dutch offices to take action. And by take action, I mean that means buildings that don't yet have an EPC will need to have an EPC and lodge that EPC in the register. And they will obviously have to, where it's needed, they will have to undertake renovation work to make sure that EPC is a C or better. The enforcement of this standard comes through usually the local municipality. And I think once again, from the work that Adam and I have both done, looking across a lot of international examples, it's really very often, I think, I struggle to find an example where the enforcement authority isn't the kind of local municipality or the city or state enforcement body. The compliance is actually, the requirement to show compliance is placed on the building owner themselves, which I think is a really interesting approach in the Netherlands. So the building owner themselves are required by the date in 2030 as regulated to register the compliant EPC. So that's a very interesting approach, because obviously that will then, through the introduction of the standard, actually increase the coverage of the EPCs to all of the regulated buildings. So a great way to also increase coverage of the building label. There are periodic penalty payments, fines, and eventually the regulations would allow buildings not to be used as offices anymore, to need to be withdrawn from that regulated sector for non-compliance. And there's a whole range of both practical, sort of technical advice support, and also commercial organisation relevant financial support, so tax incentive and green loans with preferential interest rates available in the Netherlands. And at the bottom of each of these two slides on these two examples, I've included a link to some sort of case studies that I've written up, which go into more detail about this whole framework. In addition to the details here in the Netherlands, some buildings are exempted. So, for example, a historic building for which energy efficiency improvements are much more difficult, they may negatively impact the historic nature. There is a possible exemption or a different approach to the standard for those buildings. And there is also a requirement that the measures to bring the building up to the EPC standard need to pay back within the 10 years. So moving on then to the domestic sector example, and this is a standard in England and Wales that applies to privately rented homes. And as I've said, it addresses those F and Gs and requires them to be E by 2020. So this is the only standard that's actually been fully enforced across Europe. And interestingly, the purpose here for introducing this standard really was as much a social purpose as it was a climate or energy reduction, energy demand reduction purpose. In the UK, we actually have the worst housing stock, the oldest, the least well-performing in energy terms housing stock across Europe. And that has led to a significant issue of fuel poverty. And fuel poverty we find more prevalent in the private rented sector housing. So this was a really strong driver for introducing regulations in this sector. And in fact, assessment was done before the regulations, and that said actually around 50% of the homes that would come under this regulation, so the F&G homes, would be lived in by families suffering energy poverty. So a really significant driver, as I say, there being a social driver. That said, actually it touched a relatively small percentage of homes. The private renter sector is around 20% of the whole housing stock, and around 7% were deemed to be non-compliant, so deemed to be below E. Taken as a measure of, as a percentage of the whole housing stock, that's only about 1.4%. So a very targeted measure, but without huge impact in terms of moving the whole stock. Once again, the enforcement was through the local authority and really reliant on the local authority to go out and check and enforce. And I think this is here, I'm going to pause because this is one of the most significant lessons to come out of the experience with the England and Wales standard, is that enforcement, initially at least, wasn't very effective. Local authorities didn't take much enforcement action. And there's a number of reasons behind that. Number one, local authorities had just been through a period of austerity, so their budgets had been cut, and they weren't provided any extra resources actually to undertake this new work. So, this new work was then obviously competing with their other social provision priorities. The second point is that they actually weren't empowered with the necessary access to data and existing framework within which to enforce. So why I say that is that the private rented sector in England and Wales, well, particularly in England, actually slightly different in rules in Wales, but in England in particular, the private rented sector is largely unregulated. So we don't have a register of landlords. So, and there are therefore no data sets that local authorities can call on to actually identify the rented properties and then compare them with the EPC data to find out if they are, homes that need to be checked for compliance. So it's a really significant learning, I think, is that, when designing compliance, checking and enforcement, it really need to think about both resourcing, but also about kind of integrating wherever possible into existing systems so as not to create huge extra administrative burden. And there is a slide I've included, I won't cover it, it's at the end of this deck, but it will be shared afterwards, on what I think is a much better enforcement regime from actually Boulder in Colorado. So borrowing from one of Adam's examples there. Non-compliance was punished, or the penalty for non-compliance is through a fine, and the support that was provided was mainly financial. And quite an interesting point here is that the regulations were introduced alongside a finance mechanism that allowed the building renovation to be paid off through the bills. So a sort of pay-as-you-save model that I'm sure most are familiar with. And this was really important actually to the introduction of the regulations politically, because it allowed the regulations to be introduced without requiring a landlord to make any upfront investment themselves. The investment would be covered through the loan, and the loan would be paid back through the energy bills of the tenants over a long period. I think it was a 25-year loan. That finance failed. There's a whole story we could spend an hour and a half talking about there, but actually it was replaced therefore with this cost threshold of £3,500, which is relatively low in terms of the measures that you can invest in to meet that threshold. So it's these examples that have, I think, inspired a proposal that now comes from the European Commission to extend these regulations, these standards across the whole of Europe. And I will say it's a proposal because this directive, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, is still under negotiation at the moment. I expect it to be under negotiation at least to the end of this year, if not into next year. But the proposal that came forward from the European Commission followed really very similarly this approach taken in England and Wales. So it looks at those worst two performing classes, the Gs and the Fs, and it asks them to be improved up to an E in 2 steps. So for non-domestic buildings, the worst performing G would need to be improved to an F by 2027, and then all of those buildings that are now F would need to be improved to E by 2030. Very similar approach for domestic buildings, but 3 years later, a little bit longer lead-in time for those buildings. Really important that it covers all buildings, actually, this, quite a significant rollout across the whole stock. There is some level of harmonization of the EPC scales proposed alongside this, and that harmonization would require member states to define 15% of their worst performing stock as G, which means we can kind of assess the overall impact of this proposal as being that anywhere between 15% and 30% of the worst performing buildings in every member state would need to be improved to this E standard by 2030 or 2033. Now, I will just pause here and say, the fact that this is being proposed, that regulating the entire private stock across Europe is very, very significant. The design, I think, maybe has a lot we could discuss improvements to this design. I think particularly where we are now is just moving buildings up to an EPC-E, which is still not very highly performing. Is that enough by 2030, 2033? And is it the right step to getting them on the way to full decarbonisation, which is obviously, as Adam has said a number of times, our primary goal? So I'll stop there. Just some summary points really on the things that I've highlighted. As Adam highlighted, underpinning these regulations is the importance of building stock data, building assessments, and some sort of labelling. I think particularly when talking about regulating homes, these standards need to be really clear. And I think that's where a label, a sort of A to G style label really is helpful. Just picking out another couple of points here that the regulations, I think really, particularly as they extend to homes, must come alongside an expanded framework of practical technical support and financial support. And I think particularly in Europe, as a key driver for the introduction of these standards has been the social concerns around people living in very poorly insulated homes, people living in very expensive to heat or cool homes. Then obviously a regulation isn't going to solve those problems without the financial support. And as I said, the key lesson from the UK is that these regulations are only as effective as they are enforceable. I think the last thought I'll leave you with is that actually in Europe, particularly as we are building these standards on an energy performance label, there's a key question about how do these energy performance standards fit with full decarbonisation when many countries are considering introducing, phase out of fossil fuels for heating. So I think there's a lot of work to think about how do those two types of policies interact. So my contact details are here. Do get in touch. I'm very happy to hear and share further examples. And I've also included some further references at the end of the presentation. And so I'll now pass back.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, Louise. So the mandatory minimum energy performance standard, they are made up of the three elements which defines the building subject to and the calculation trigger points. We have understood how diverse systems are in different jurisdictions, which is very important for us as we think about the Japanese system going forward. And on top of that, the EU is now negotiating an ambitious new framework based on the various existing country-based systems and the importance of EPC, the certificate. We would like to discuss about this later on. Now we will go into the questions and answers. Questions have arrived by the system already. If I may, I would like to start with some confirmations about the buildings that will be covered by these requirements. If I may start with asking Louise about the Dutch Netherlands example you mentioned. In Europe, including detached individual houses, it's an extensive system. Am I correct that Europe emphasizes covering detached individual residences, not only decarbonization, there are other objectives as well?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the Dutch standard that I identified, it applies to offices, but there are a number of examples of standards that are applied to homes, residences, so in France, in England and Wales and Scotland. And yes, the standards that apply to homes generally apply to both flats and through to individual detached homes, terrace homes. And I think really importantly, as I said, from the social perspective, most certainly in France and in England and Wales, a key driver there has been to ensure that housing and households living in those homes are improved to sort of future-proof standards. And I think the key with the previous approach has been that we've relied on incentives and we've relied on information. We've relied really on building owners who are able and willing to undertake renovation. And of course, that misses a lot of housing. For example, housing, particularly in the rented sector, where the landlord doesn't really have an incentive without a regulation to introduce renovation measures, because obviously the tenant will take the benefit of the warmer home and the lower bills. So it's really key, I think, that these regulations apply to housing to ensure that we have a fair distribution of renovation across the stock, and some individual households don't get fully left behind in the transition. And particularly relevant at the moment in the price crisis that we're seeing in Europe, that actually we ensure that we focus our measures first on those people who are suffering most.
Thank you very much. In Europe, basically, residential energy use is very high. So I think that is something that is in the background. What would you say?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, depending on climatic regions, on the condition of the building stock, but certainly in the UK, residential energy use is very high because it's a chillier country, and because we have the very, very worst performing stock. I think not only the energy use is significant, but actually the impacts of not being able to access adequate energy services is very, very important. And that's obviously very clear where people can't heat their homes properly, but also becoming really evident with more extreme weather events for people who can't keep their homes cool. So perhaps in those countries, that we wouldn't see really high residential energy use because they're warmer countries, and so we aren't seeing it heating energy use, but we do need to see access to cooling as climates get warmer.
Thank you very much. In contrast, in the United States, it seems that the focus is more on the larger buildings, larger constructions. Am I correct in this impression?
Yes, and I think it's for a few different reasons. I think we probably in the US have a higher percentage of non-residential energy use and emissions than many of the European countries do. We have a very large and vibrant service sector of commercial buildings. And I think the other driver of why the US is focused on larger buildings is that these larger buildings use much more energy. So you can basically focus on a smaller number of buildings that are impacted and regulated and still have quite significant impacts, while if you go to individual households, you have to be hitting many more buildings. I think there's also hitting many more buildings to realize the same level of energy savings and emissions reductions. I think there's also a little bit more of a political aversion in the United States to wanting to try to do more regulations on individual homeowners, that homeowners are voters, and whereas I think there's a perception that larger private landlords of either non-residential buildings or large multifamily buildings have more resources in general than individual homeowners would.
Thank you.
That was very informative. We believe that we can keep on discussing that point, but we have questions raised by our audience. So let us pick them up. Let us try to answer those questions briefly. First question, let me pick up the first question. New York and Washington, D.C. or New York and Washington, they have standards, but how much percentage of emissions will have to be reduced from the current level?
Yeah, I
The
think
approach
in
to
both
standards.
in both the New York and Washington cases, the targets were established not really just on what the current levels are, but both of those cities have GHG reduction targets that go back to a 2005 or a 2007 baseline period. So what we're looking at in New York with the 2024 limits is a 40% reduction for those buildings that are covered from the 2007 baseline period. But that's not 40% from today, because we have already had around a 20 to 25% reduction from that baseline period. Much of it from cleaning of the electricity grid and our district energy system, and a smaller percentage of it from energy efficiency savings. And similarly in Washington, D.C., they've seen very similar kinds of reductions, mostly from the grid cleaning, with some slightly bigger energy efficiency reductions in Washington. So around a 10 to 15% reduction
だ
from
い
where
たい10から15%これから削減です。Thank you very much. So for the entire cities, there is the overall reduction target and how much GHG emission has to be reduced. The targets will have to be met by individual jurisdictions. Is that the approach?
Yes, I think at least in the US cities, for the most part, there's an economy-wide reduction target. And in many cases, that would be 40% by 2030, and then getting to 80% by 2040 or 2050. And then there is a different fraction of emissions that comes from buildings in New York City, where we have a very large and efficient public transit system. Buildings represent about 70% of emissions, whereas other cities where there's a lot less public transit and a lot more automobile use, buildings might only be 40 to 50% of the total emissions. So usually with that kind of a inventory, the standards are targeting, basically looking at the building sector and its emissions, and then what reductions need to happen and trying to drive the target from that. So as I said, New York and Washington, it's 40% below a 2007 or 2009 baseline, which means about a 15% reduction from where we are today.
Thank you so much. About the EPC, asking Louise, that is effective for 10 years. What does that mean? So after 10 years, the labeling will have to be reassessed and renewed again. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. If the building goes through one of the trigger points that require the label. So if you've bought your home 10 years ago, and it had a label assessed at that point, if you then want to sell it at 12 years, after 12 years of owning it, you will have to have a new label created. And that label would then obviously pick up any improvements you've made while living in that house. So having your windows changed, for example, or popping in some more loft insulation.
Thank you very much. Next question is, well, Japan and US weatherproofing performance of outer cover of buildings. Let us skip this question for the moment. And deterioration of construction material, whether there is a heightened awareness and interest about that. What about deterioration of materials used in buildings? Is that being considered?
I think that is something that's a consideration. I saw part of the question or chat was referring to salt degradation. I don't think we have as much of the salt degradation issue, but we do have a lot of concerns about moisture accumulating, and then in cold regions where that moisture might freeze in a building and have a lot of impact on the building envelope longevity. I think there's a lot of work going into renovation practices to be able to make sure that the building renovation contractors are aware of some of those construction quality issues to minimize the chances of that. But it is a risk, at least in North America. I think there's also quite different kind of building construction style between the US, Europe, and Japan, in that we have much more wood frame construction, particularly in residential buildings in the US, while it's much more masonry or stone, I think, in many other parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Again, about the EPC, the enforcement, after all, is important, which means the implementation, actually imposing the rules, is important. So by when the EPC will become mandatory? That is the first question. Louise?
I think the question is around by when would the EPC become mandatory across the whole stock? Obviously, we have the trigger points at the moment, they are mandatory. It's a really good question, and I think there has been discussion in Europe around, do we need to wait for the whole stock to be covered by an EPC before we can introduce these standards? And I think, that has been a really interesting discussion, and the clear answer from that has been, we haven't got time. So I think, this is why I dwelt on that Dutch example, where actually the regulations are part of the driver for expanding the EPC to the whole stock. And I think that's a clear way that we need to use the regulations, not wait for the whole stock to be covered. I think we need some level of coverage. So we have a well-known, proven building labeling framework that people recognize. They know what an A or a G or a B is. And we have enough data on the national stock to make sort of models of the stock. So we need enough coverage. We don't need whole coverage. And I think, therefore, as I say, as long as the standard is introduced early enough, so they are not standards we introduce today and enforce tomorrow. All of these standards are introduced with reasonable lead times of generally 4 years or more. And by that, I think you communicate the standard really early, and then that gives the building owner time to then go and get a building assessment or consult their contractor, figure out what building measures, what renovation measures they would need to meet the standard, and then have the EPC assessment done as a result of finishing that renovation.
Thank you. Regarding the EPC, there are significant number of questions. Some basic questions are included, and an interesting point: who makes the assessment, in what way, and who conducts the assessment, who pays for the expenses of the assessment? Those are some of the questions as well. Of course, there could be a variety of systems. Can you tell us some information, Louise?
Yeah, they're really good questions, actually. So in every country, we have registered EPC assessors. So you have to have a course, go through a course, and are therefore then on a register of assessment. I think it's fair to say that practice in each of the countries in the EU is different. And in some countries, I think that training is very robust. And, you get really good, not only assessments, but advice given to building owners through that assessment process. In other countries, I think perhaps the approach is just taken more in terms of a compliance. We just get the assessment done, and therefore it's not perhaps as useful a process. And once again, I think there are lots of projects looking at assessing these training regimes for EPC assessors, assessing the quality guidance, the level of quality that we have on the EPC assessment. So there's interesting work been done at a research level at looking at the good practice and the not so good practice. And the question around cost is a really important one, and the cost is held with the building owner. So the building owner at those trigger points of sale or renting their home out would need to, or their building would need to pay for the assessment. And this is a really good question, because obviously the assessment has sort of the potential to be seen as a burden. And so in some countries, in fact, probably the majority of countries, there has been a drive to reduce the cost, reduce the burden of these assessments. But of course, with a reduced cost assessment, you get a reduced quality assessment. And we have heard sort of, pretty horror stories actually of, assessors, even barely entering the building, sort of particularly on a house by house basis, sort of, knowing the build form, whether it be a Victorian terrace, which is very, very common in the UK in particular, and actually kind of, turning up, having a look at it, maybe stepping inside and looking at a few bits and pieces, but then just basically using a standardized model for that built form. And clearly, this has been a drive to reduce costs, which has led to, that reduction in standards. So it's a real tension point, I think, in getting a really useful assessment that also provides advice and all of the entry point information that building owners need, versus the cost of doing that really well.
I think that has been one of the drivers in the US for using the measured performance as well, in that basically there is in many ways both a simpler way of assessing the performance by just adding up the energy bills and summing them for the year. And particularly for the larger buildings, I think some questions about the relative quality of calculated or modeled energy performance. And that's why we've really moved more toward having most of the US policies based on measured energy performance and emissions.
So in that sense, I think there are various approaches, and no matter how you do this, you need to be taking various countermeasures. That's my observation. Now, we do have many, many more questions, but let us change our perspective a little bit and shift our discussion to a different point. In introducing this system, as was discussed so far, what has been the most challenging point in introducing these systems? And also these local authorities, local governments, their roles. Can we hear about this, please? Starting with Adam, what would you say?
I think this relates a bit to one of the questions I see in the chat about the political reaction to setting standards. And I think it's varied. There is a loud and very vocal environmental advocacy group that feels that we need to be acting much more ambitiously and much more quickly. And then on the opposite side of that, you have the construction and real estate owners industry saying that this is going to be very expensive and is going to take a long time to change. The local authorities have to balance all of that. I think in the majority of the cities that have adopted building performance standards so far in the US, it's more the progressive liberal cities that are more left on the political spectrum that are looking more at the environmental and social issues than the potential costs. I don't know, as I've said a couple of times, none of the policies are actually in place yet. They've been adopted, but they haven't had to be enforced yet because the effective dates are just coming into force over the next couple of years. So I think we'll have a lot more idea on that issue of how feasible are these and are there major issues. I would say that having adequate budget for the local authorities for implementation of the policies is critical. That it's relatively easy to pass legislation, but then developing the implementing regulations and being able to have some valid administration enforcement does take resources. And that is a kind of an ongoing issue in some of the jurisdictions, even in New York City, where we have a good deal more resources than most places. Being sure that the local authorities have adequate staff to be able to implement and provide enforcement actions is a significant challenge.
Thank you. To overcome those issues and challenges, many cities could work together, work in coalition, share information, or not only the federal government, but the NGOs, there should be support by different parties. Would I be correct?
Very much so. And I think that's a big part of why that National Building Performance Standards Coalition has been set up over the past year, because the cities realize, the jurisdictions realize that by collaborating, they can learn from each other more effectively. A lot of that's been done informally over the last few years, but I think the coalition is really an initiative to try and formalize that and bring additional resources to the collaboration. And there's a good deal of financial support coming both from philanthropic organizations in the U.S. and as well from the government at this point. Although the Biden administration has had more ambition for what they would like to have in terms of resources for a lot of the environmental and climate activities, that so far has not been able to make it through our Congress.
Thank you very much. Louise, if I may, in Europe, what is the most challenging situation? What might be the hurdle, barriers, and how are the local government authorities trying to overcome? Maybe the central government plays a large role, am I correct?
I think very similar to what Adam said is, the first hurdle is the political acceptability to introduce these standards, particularly when they extend to homes. There's a big discourse about the state overstepping by regulating people's private property. And I think that, that's a very, very significant hurdle to overcome. I think then the next big hurdle is as has already been said, how to resource the renovations so that these regulations don't become a burden on people that can't afford to regulate. There are a number of countries, and Scotland is the country that I always refer to as having actually a really good framework of both very accessible practical advice and subsidies and finance that really sort of cover the situations of most households. So they're suitable, very, very high levels of subsidy, accompanied by zero interest loans that up to 100% for the lowest income people, as well as subsidy and loan combinations for landlords and for owner occupiers who are better off on higher incomes. So I think that is really the kind of biggest challenge is how do we mobilize that amount of resource, both for the enabling, so local authorities delivering the enforcement, signposting people to get help, then for the help services, the advisors, the hand holders, for training the supply chain as well, because there's a lot of that needs to happen. So that kind of enabling resource, and then the funding and finance as well. This is a huge challenge to mobilize that amount of money. And clearly, the central government has an absolutely key role. I think particularly in the kind of sending signals to the supply chain. And I think in many countries across Europe, we are realizing now that we simply don't have the capacity in the supply chain to deliver building renovations at the scale that we have them, that we need them in, particularly to 2030. So there's a lot of signaling and from the central governments and a lot of training programs that need to be set up and a lot of kind of investment. And I think the regulations actually are very important in signaling to the supply chain, because they not only tell the supply chain, the regulations can be very easily translated into a number of buildings being renovated, and actually they can be translated into what kind of renovations are these buildings going to need. It's quite easy to look at the major archetypes in the building archetypes in the stock, look at the standard that needs to be met and say, well, actually for most of those, they're going to need glazing, roof insulation and underfloor insulation. And the supply chain can then know exactly where the demand is going to be and the numbers that they're going to need to scale up for. So it's much more guaranteed for them, for the investment that they need to make in scaling up. And so I think the standards can be really helpful in that regard.
I think I'd add one thing to what Louise just said of, the supply chain. One of the advantages to the building performance standards is setting more of a long-term signal of the kinds of improvements that need to be made, instead of just saying, here's financing that's available for these kind of improvements. When you have these targets that are out there and the real estate industry realizes that these kind of policies are going to drive significant new retrofit activity, I think what we're seeing in some of the jurisdictions that have the building performance policies in place, that it really is improving the supply chain, helping to create more involvement such that the contractor and the capacity is being built because of the recognition of what the policies are driving.
Having listened to you, it seems that the regulation, what kind of standards are to be introduced through regulation towards the future? That is one aspect. And also the industry who need to respond to those regulations. To what extent can they accommodate that regulation? I think it's a kind of a chicken and egg situation, checking each other out. But in the future, working towards the future, by showing the schedule of where you're going, that would facilitate supply chain and various stakeholders. There's going to be information provided to them so that they can be more prepared. That is how I understood it to be. Adam, what would you say?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And, again, there's a bit of uncertainty as some of the regulations are being finalized right now. And some building owners and other stakeholders are saying, we're not going to make, major investment decisions until those regulations are finalized, but that's coming sooner. And as you say, a chicken and egg situation. There are likely going to be some owners that say, this is one of many different regulations. I'd rather just pay a penalty or a fine instead of making these changes. But I think there is also these regulations are coming at a time when there's growing environmental awareness and recognition that large companies and large building owners need to take on more environmental responsibility. So there's both the mandatory regulations that are taking effect that are driving some activity, but also on some level a voluntary recognition that we need to be more ambitious than what we've been in the past as well. And those are really working together to drive a good deal more interest and increased investment.
Thank you very much. Another question from a slightly different perspective about renewable energy, natural energy, about the introduction of renewables. Will that also proceed in accordance with the spread of building standards? Maybe starting with Louise about renewable expansion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'd make a distinction, obviously, between renewables in electricity, which is, progressing in some countries in Europe really very swiftly, and the distinction between renewables there and renewables in heating, which is progressing much more slowly in Europe. Notwithstanding the fact that in some European countries, actually, particularly Nordic countries, there is already actually a good penetration of renewables, particularly renewable electricity in heating. In many countries in Europe, we still have, for example, in Poland, a good proportion of heating is still delivered by coal. In the Netherlands, in the UK, vast majority of the heating is still delivered by gas, and we have other, by grid gas rather, sorry, and we have other kind of LPG and bottled gas used elsewhere, as well as oil in large proportions in places like Ireland. So it's a really good question about how we make sure that renewables, particularly for heating, are scaled up at the same time. Interesting example comes from Germany, where introducing a requirement that I think from 2024 that all heating systems in buildings, when replaced, will need to be replaced with a system that relies on a very high percentage of renewable energy. So this is really driving away from the installation of oil systems or gas systems to the use of heat pumps, for example, to some extent the use of biomass, although I think we're quite aware actually in Europe that biomass, at a large scale isn't suitable as a heating fuel. So I think it's a great question, because I think this interaction between the energy performance standard, which as Adam has said earlier in his presentation, is good at driving energy efficiency, but then isn't so good at driving the kind of carbon reduction and the introduction of renewables. So I think a number of countries in Europe, and I point to Scotland here again, because personal interest, I've just finished a really interesting report, I will say myself, for the Scottish Government, building on the Scottish framework that's been proposed in a strategy last year to introduce minimum energy performance standards for all homes, but then very shortly afterwards introduce one of these phase outs of gas boilers. So these two policies actually working hand in hand, and the timing there is very important, so that you can ensure that building owners, particularly households, are guided through the regulations to improve their energy efficiency first. And then when their boiler breaks down, they're encouraged to replace it with a heat pump or another renewable or electricity-based source of heating. So I think there's some really, the next step in this research is to look at how some of these minimum energy performance standards interact with those phase outs of fossil fuels for heating. The other key example I would turn to as well is the Netherlands, which is phasing out its fossil gas grid. And they've introduced a really interesting home insulation standard to ready homes to be taken off the gas grid and prepare them for whatever solution might come their way. And the local authorities are driving that gas away from gas transition. So that's a super interesting example as well.
I think I would add that many of the leading jurisdictions, the cities and states, are doing a combination of different policies in that, beyond the building performance standards, there are a variety of different kinds of policies, renewable portfolio standards, and other activities that are really having quite significant and quite rapid changes to bring more renewable energy into the electric grid in particular. And the other piece that we're seeing besides the building performance standards is kind of a growing interest in phasing out of fossil fuel heating systems, initially in new construction, but then potentially for requiring a change at the time of end of equipment life. And in New York City, late last year in December, the city council passed a requirement saying that no new fossil heating systems going into new buildings that are constructed for low-rise buildings after 2024 and for high-rise buildings from 2027 on. So there's a kind of a combination of the performance standards are attacking one part of the problem, and other policies are working at other pieces of it as well.
Thank you very much. There are many interesting questions coming our way, But unfortunately, I think we are starting to be short on time. So far, we heard about mandatory performance standards for existing buildings. We have been introduced to such a concept of measures, and depending on the region and country, various systems, various designs are being put forth. And Japan will be entering into a period when we need to consider such a system, and that was very, very informative. Especially as an assumption, performance rating and labeling system are very important, and the reporting system also is very important, and that is something that we need to be very cognizant of. Adam, Louise, thank you so very much at late at night and early in the morning for joining us to give us a very important discussion. And to the viewers for the past 1.5 hours, thank you very much for your participation. This webinar is going to be made public through a video at a later date so that various people can view this program. One announcement: at REI, Ms. Ichianagi has published a report about energy conservation of buildings in Germany, as well as measures and legislation for use of renewable energy. This report can be viewed from our website at REI, just for your reference. Going forward, we would like to continue to give reports in this area. So please pay attention to our reports. It is upon us to develop the system for Japan. We want to work towards effective system and policy implementation in Japan. And today we heard something very informative and useful for that aim of ours. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Very interesting.